We begin tonight in France with a fresh wave of anger against President Emmanuel Macron's pension and retirement reform plans. Hundreds of thousands joined traditional May Day demonstrations today to condemn the plans, which would see the minimum retirement age raised by 2 years to the age of 64. The country's interior minister says that more than 100 police officers were injured in clashes with protesters nationwide.
Clashes with police, smashed windows. Paris is once again alight as angry people protest unpopular plans to push the minimum retirement age to 64. Those marching here say this is a May Day call for workers' rights.
We don't want to die working, we want to live and see our children and grandchildren grow up and enjoy it, because we'll have worked all our lives. I'm retired and I'm disgusted by what they're doing.
Young people, it's very important for us to be here because it's our generation that will suffer the consequences of this policy.
Hundreds of thousands turned out across the country. Much of the frustration here is directed toward President Emmanuel Macron, who says the reform is needed to keep the pension system financially viable. But the French leader's approval ratings have plummeted. And this analyst says there's only one winner here.
Looking at opinion polls and vote projections, this all tends to benefit populist extreme right parties like the National Rally, because they symbolize anger towards Emmanuel Macron. There has never been such a swift drop in the French president's popularity. And that's what's problematic, because he has 4 years left in power, and it will be complicated for him to pass any new reforms.
The pension law is now moving ahead, and some think this May Day mobilisation is the movement's last gasp after multiple nationwide strikes. But these Parisians say they'll keep up the pressure, and the fallout from this political battle may be felt for years to come.
And our Rosie Burchard, she is in Paris for us tonight. Rosie, let's talk about what's happening there right now. It's been a day where we saw a big turnout, which the trade unions had called for.
The square behind me is where this protest all began, and you can see there's a statue in the middle of that square, and protesters have decked it out with a T-shirt which says the words Macron démission. That means Macron resign, and that was the message from many of the people who turned out to march who I spoke to today. Some of them trade union members who are unhappy with the content of this pension reform law and with the way that it was passed. But of course, some of those who turned out did also end up clashing with police. And there was a descent into violence in some parts of the city and in some parts of France. Now, we know, according to the Interior Ministry, that more than 200 people have been detained, more than 100 police officers have been injured, and the French Prime Minister has slammed that violence on the sidelines of these May Day protests as unacceptable.
Rosie, today, May 1st, May Day, is a traditional day of workers' protest across much of Europe and around much of the world. Is today's turnout, we're talking about numbers here, is it significantly bigger?
Well, according to the police here in Paris, there was more than 100,000 people. If you ask the trade unions, they say it was more like 500,000. But certainly from what I witnessed, the streets were full. I could see demonstrators in all directions. And of course, usually May Day is a sort of celebration of workers' rights, but it wasn't so much of a festive mood here today. Instead, there was a lot of frustration and bigger political questions looming over the whole affair. On the one hand, will this be the last of this movement? We've seen lots of strikes already across the nation. That's not what protesters say. They say they'll keep turning out. And secondly, well, what's the longer-term political ramifications of all this resentment for French President Macron, who remains in office, but who, as we heard, whose popularity ratings have plummeted? And one political analyst who we spoke to described this to me really as now a political impasse in France.
Yeah, it's looking like a political impasse, and we have to keep in mind that President Macron, he doesn't have to run for re-election. He's in his second and final term, but he's got another, 4 years. Has he used up all of his political capital on this one issue? I mean, will he be able to, lead the country and govern for the next 4 years?
Well, listen, I was here in Paris when French President Macron won his second term, and he did advertise this as one of his missions, to reform this labyrinthine pension system. But of course, it has proved entirely unpopular, and we've seen calls for his resignation. One protester said to me he's simply arrogant and selfish, and he doesn't listen to anyone. Of course, those are allegations he rejects. Macron says these reforms are absolutely needed. France's population is ageing. And of course, there are other countries in Europe where the pension age is already higher than 64, the age which the pension retirement will be raised to here in France. I spoke to one protester who said, well, we simply don't care what it's like in other countries. We want our rights to be maintained here. That woman who we heard from who said we want to be able to see our grandchildren and grow old and to be able to live more. So what it looks like here is really a kind of fractured social contract, or at least that's what we're hearing from the demonstrators. But it certainly will make for a tricky time ahead for President Macron.
DW's Rosie Burchard with the latest tonight from Paris. Rosie, thank you.